Welcome back to your quiet corner of curiosity, the subconscious classroom, your sanctuary after sundown. We're grateful to share this space with you again tonight. In this 7-part journey, we drift through centuries of impossible ambition. Not to conquer the world, but to count it. Stars, seeds, bones, dreams. From ancient skywatchers to Enlightenment encyclopedists, from dusty cabinets of wonders to infinite digital databases, we'll follow the strange and beautiful trail of those who tried to list, label, and preserve everything before it slipped away. You are no longer here in the now. You are sitting in a scriptorium, copying an index of sins by candlelight. You are watching a librarian measure cloud formations with a pencil. You are whispering numbers into the void, hoping someone will remember them. Let us begin. Part 1: When the world refused to sit still. It began with curiosity. Before science, before maps, before measurements of time itself, humans looked out at the chaos of nature and thought, how many? How many stars in the sky? How many seeds in the field? How many gods? Bones, sins, dreams, raindrops, footsteps. How many kinds of everything? This is the story of those who tried to count it all, and who failed, gloriously. The ancient world didn't lack wonder, it was soaked in it. But wonder alone wasn't enough. The human brain itched for boundaries, lists, categories. It wasn't enough to marvel at the stars. Someone had to name them. Not enough to pick herbs. Someone had to write them down. Not enough to fear sin. Someone had to rank them: pride, envy, gluttony, sloth. The world was too strange to leave unnumbered. So began the long, impossible project of counting the uncountable. In Babylon, more than 2,500 years ago, skywatchers sat atop ziggurats with clay tablets and styluses, staring into the heavens. They weren't guessing, they were documenting. They tried to number the stars, track their motions, predict their returns. They built catalogues, not constellations like we know today, but lists of bright points, ordered by brightness and place in the sky. Each one named, each one counted. Some tablets held hundreds. It wasn't about curiosity alone. It was about power. If you could predict the sky, you could predict harvests, tides, omens, the will of the gods. You could control the future, or at least prepare for it. So these early star counters sat for years, repeating numbers under their breath, scratching cuneiform lines into soft clay, trying to pin down the heavens. The Greeks followed. Pythagoras, the philosopher of numbers, believed that the entire universe was built on math. Not just physical things, but music, ethics, even the soul. If everything was number, then everything could be counted. The stars were not gods, but math problems. Later, Ptolemy, working from Alexandria, created a catalog of over 1,000 stars. Each had coordinates, magnitudes, and corrections. His Almagest would remain the definitive guide to the night sky for over 1,000 years. And yet he was wrong. His models were off, his orbits flawed, his numbers skewed. But it didn't matter. The attempt was what counted. He tried, and in trying, he brought order. Meanwhile, in India and China, scholars were busy cataloging other infinities. The Chinese imperial court conducted detailed censuses, tracking not just people but tools, trees, wells, and bells. Records stretched back centuries, listing everything from the number of oxen in a village to how many bolts of silk were produced each spring. The aim wasn't abstraction, it was administration, control. You can't tax what you don't count. In India, Buddhist monks cataloged internal things: thoughts, sensations, types of suffering. One early text claimed there were 84,000 different doorways to delusion, a catalog not of the physical, but of the mind. Elsewhere, Ayurvedic scholars created manuals listing hundreds of medicinal plants, symptoms, and bodily humors. The project wasn't finished. It never could be, but they didn't stop trying. In the West, medieval monks took up the counting torch, not of people or planets, but of knowledge. In cold stone scriptoria, they copied and recopied vast books of everything. Encyclopedias, not like the modern A to Z, but grand, philosophical inventories of the world. One early Christian encyclopedia tried to list every known bird, beast, mineral, and vice, not to categorize scientifically, but to understand God's design. Each beast had a moral. The pelican wounded itself to feed its chicks, therefore Christ. The lion slept with its eyes open, therefore the resurrection. The act of counting was also an act of belief. If you could list everything God made, you could come one step closer to Him. But counting had other uses. It became punishment. How many Hail Marys? How many lashes? How many years in purgatory for this sin versus that one? A ledger of morality emerged, numbers stapled to the soul. Even the afterlife was indexed. The medieval mind loved lists. 7 deadly sins, 9 choirs of angels, 12 apostles. For horsemen, 3 theological virtues, not because numbers were decorative, but because they were divine. To name something was to know it. To number it was to hold it in place. But not everything wanted to stay still. By the Renaissance, the obsession with listing turned outward again. Explorers returned from distant coasts with strange plants, beasts, and peoples, none of which fit neatly into old categories. A new kind of counting began. Cabinets of curiosity popped up across Europe. Rooms filled with labeled specimens, sorted by shape, origin, smell, color, or whim. In some, you might find a narwhal tusk labeled unicorn horn. In others, a dried lizard called basilisk. These collections weren't quite scientific, but they were stepping stones. They were attempts to count the world object by object, shelf by shelf. The problem? The more they collected, the less sense it made. Nature refused to cooperate. One flower blended into another. One beetle had 5 variations. A fossil couldn't be placed anywhere, and yet the counting continued. Enter the encyclopedists. In the 18th century, in Enlightenment France, scholars tried to build a total inventory of human knowledge. The result? The Encyclopedia, a sprawling, multi-volume beast compiled by dozens of writers and editors. It listed tools, trades, philosophies, species, instruments, diseases, minerals. It included illustrations, cross-references, and digressions. It was not finished, could not be finished, but it tried. One contributor was so obsessed with hats, he cataloged them by region, material, and profession. Another listed all known types of rope. Another documented every known musical instrument, some never heard again. It was absurd. It was beautiful. It was bold. And it wasn't alone. Across the Channel, British naturalists were busy building their own lists of birds, bugs, clouds. One man spent years trying to categorize all cloud formations. He named them cumulus, stratus, cirrus. Stuck. Another man wandered the coastlines, classifying seaweed. Another counted the number of seeds in poppy pods. All of them gripped by the same hunger, to bring chaos into line, to number nature. And still the world pushed back. For every list made, something slipped through. A flower bloomed in a shape never seen before. A storm twisted in a new formation. A new species appeared on a forgotten island. The counters could only gasp and revise. Even now, this tradition continues. We count stars with telescopes that see to the edge of the known universe and find more every time. We count human genes only to discover complexities we didn't expect. We count people with censuses and surveys, and always we miss someone. But we keep trying, because counting is a kind of love. It says you matter. You are not invisible. You are part of the whole. And in that whole, whether stars, seeds, sins, or sand grains, there is always room for one more. Part 2, the desire to measure the infinite. Some things resist numbering not because they are too big, but because they are too slippery. Dreams, thoughts, the quiet moments between raindrops. Still, across centuries, people tried to count even these, knowing full well they would fail, but hoping the attempt might shape meaning from mist. Take the dream counters of the ancient world. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, dreams were not personal but public. Kings and priests tracked them, interpreted them, listed them by type and symbol. Clay tablets and papyri carried catalogues. If you dream of snakes, it means treachery. If you dream of rivers, it means fortune. If your teeth fall out in sleep, beware of death. The dreams weren't private nonsense. They were omens, and omens could be indexed. In ancient Egypt, one fragmentary papyrus lists more than 100 dreams, their meanings, and whether they were good or bad. To dream of eating crocodile meat, good. To dream of climbing a palm tree, bad. It's not science, it's a kind of poetic accounting. The mind as ledger, the soul as riddle. In Greece, Aristotle tried to formalize dreams too, but others were more whimsical. Artemidorus, a 2nd century writer, composed a 5-book encyclopedia of dream meanings. It had entries on sneezing, flying, forgetting shoes, dancing with dead relatives. Not because he believed every dream was sacred, but because he believed they could be grouped, that even chaos had themes. And what is a list if not a structure for surviving uncertainty? By the Middle Ages, Christian mystics had their own versions. They saw visions, recorded them, categorized the symbols. Some monks filled entire volumes with accounts of dreams and waking ecstasies, sorted by emotion, cause, and divine weight. You could, if you were diligent, track the architecture of heaven just by indexing the metaphors of saints. But that wasn't the only infinity being measured. Consider silence. It might seem impossible to count, but in many monastic orders, silence was broken into types. There was the silence of obedience, the silence of prayer, the silence of punishment. Each had rules, each had meaning. In some abbeys, the rule book might include 50 ways to be silent, and only one way to speak. This wasn't abstract, it was practical. A novice monk was trained in gesture and gazed to signal everything from pass the bread to the roof is leaking. No words spoken, yet everything communicated. And those signals were documented, counted, passed down. Even the unsaid could be measured. In the Renaissance, a similar impulse emerged, not with silence, but with time. Not abstract hours, but moments. Philosophers debated how many individual instants made up a minute. Could a second be divided? Could thought be measured in pulses? One German clockmaker in the 1500s built a mechanical device to mark every heartbeat. He wanted to track life itself, not just in years, but in ticks. Every second mattered. Every one could be counted. This was the dawn of a new obsession, the measurement of the small. Naturalists started counting flower petals. One noted that lilies always had 6. Another counted the spots on ladybugs. 7. Always 7. Another tried to count how many wing beats per second a hummingbird made.
No camera, no microscope.
Just eyes and persistence. It wasn't about being right. It was about finding pattern, order, meaning. A curious example. In 17th century London, a man named John Grunt began studying the bills of mortality, weekly death notices published by the city. They were grim lists: who died, where, and of what. But Grunt saw more than tragedy, he saw data. He began counting, tabulating, and looking for patterns. How many died of teeth? How many of grief? How many of God's judgment? He noticed odd things. Certain diseases peaked in certain seasons. Infant deaths were disturbingly common. Accidents spiked after holidays. His tables didn't just count deaths, they hinted at life. Grunt is now considered one of the founders of demography. But at the time, he was simply asking, what happens when we count what hurts? Others began to follow. Census takers started walking door to door, not just in cities, but in nations. How many people? How many cows? How many windows per house? What religion? What trade? It was the slow turning of humanity into number. Sometimes this brought good. Resources were distributed better. Hospitals planned for disease. Roads were built where people lived. Other times it brought cruelty. Populations became quotas. Lives became taxes. People were no longer seen, only added. Even here, counting revealed its paradox. It makes things visible and it erases them. Back in the quiet corners of Europe, encyclopedists were counting less painful things. Some created dictionaries of color. One 18th century artist tried to name and categorize every visible hue in the natural world. Not red, blue, green, but hummingbird throat, fox blood, stormy sky before dusk, each given a number, a chart, a place in the order. Another man tried to count every known musical scale. He built strange instruments just to hear the spaces between notes. Another inventor, obsessed with smells, cataloged odors in books with scent strips, hoping one day they could be preserved. None of these projects ended. That was the point. To count was not to finish. It was to care, to preserve, to point and say, this matters. And still the world spilled over. The more one tried to count, the more exceptions appeared. The botanical gardens in Paris swelled with unnamed hybrids. The insect cabinets in Berlin groaned with mislabeled beetles. Even the stars refused to sit still. New ones appeared, old ones disappeared, comets streaked without warning. One astronomer, near the end of his life, admitted in frustration, I have numbered more than 20,000 stars, and I feel I have grasped none. But still, he counted. Why? Because to count is to draw close. It is to say, I see you. Even now, in a world of digital maps and satellite databases, the urge continues. We count how many steps we take, how many hours we sleep, how many emails remain unread. We count the grains of rice we eat, the heartbeats per minute, the miles to the next appointment. Some of it is compulsive, some is survival, some is ritual. But deep down, it's something older, a whisper in the mind that began in the dust of Babylon, beneath the stars, with someone quietly asking, how many? And listening for the answer. Part 3, cabinets, catalogues, and the ordering instinct. By the dawn of the 18th century, the urge to count had matured into something even more ambitious: classification. No longer satisfied with simply naming things or tallying totals, scholars now wanted systems. They wanted everything: every rock, every plant, every disease, every idea, put in its proper place, filed neatly in a conceptual cabinet. And in many cases, that cabinet was literal. Enter the cabinet of curiosities. Known in Latin as a wonderkammer or wonder room, it began in Renaissance Europe and exploded during the Enlightenment. These were not furniture pieces, but entire rooms. Miniature museums crammed with bones, books, minerals, teeth, coral, fossils, musical instruments, and bits of taxidermy. A narwhal tusk stood beside a Roman coin. A dried toad might be labeled dragon. A piece of coral next to a carved saint. There was little order, but endless intention. These collectors weren't hoarders. They were organizers of the cosmos. Each item said, "The world is vast, but I can hold part of it here." Some cabinets were private, used for meditation or scholarly conversation. Others were public, meant to astonish guests. Either way, they represented a worldview. Everything could be seen, held, and arranged. The whole world in a room. But chaos crept in. The more objects were gathered, the harder it became to organize them. Was a fossil a plant or a rock? Was coral alive or dead? Did a unicorn horn belong with horses or saints? Something had to give, and so came taxonomy, a way of sorting nature that could stretch as wide as the earth. The champion of this new order was Carl Linnaeus, a Swedish botanist who, in the mid-1700s, attempted what few had dared, to classify all living things in a structured, hierarchical way. Kingdom, class, order, genus, species. He invented binomial nomenclature, those Latin names we still use today: Homo sapiens, Canis lupus, Panthera leo. Linnaeus didn't just count animals and plants. He placed them in relationship to each other. Trees were not just trees, they were genera, subdivided by leaf, fruit, and bark. Birds were grouped by beak shape and flight style. Even humans were slotted into categories, though with uncomfortable implications we're still reckoning with today. But for all its flaws, his system stuck. Because it worked, it brought structure, and suddenly the world seemed knowable. Soon, thousands of people across Europe were gathering specimens and classifying them in Linnaean terms. Museums exploded in size. Universities raced to expand their natural history collections. In Paris, the Jardin des Plantes became a living catalogue. In London, the British Museum ballooned with global finds. Some purchased, others seized. Ships returned from every continent bearing crates of leaves, skulls, feathers, crystals, and parasites, all labeled, all numbered. This was the golden age of counting the world. But it was also a period of deep imbalance. The people doing the counting were often European. The things being counted, the plants, animals, artifacts, and even people, came from elsewhere. Colonization fed this system, and the cataloging, though scientific, was also an exercise in power. Still, the obsession with order continued. A man in Germany spent 40 years collecting beetles. Another in the Netherlands made hundreds of wax models of fruits, each labeled with species, ripeness, origin. In Scotland, a minister named Robert Kirk attempted to catalog the behavior of fairies, what they wore, when they appeared, whether they could be trusted. He wrote it all down as if it were natural history. To him, it was. Even the abstract came under review. Mathematicians attempted to list every kind of curve, every kind of number, the infinity of infinities. They sketched trees of equations, trying to branch reality into logic. And in medicine, things turned inward again. Doctors began recording symptoms with unprecedented precision. Fevers were graded, rashes described by size, color, progression. One doctor recorded the exact timing of his patient's sneezes, 12 per minute, then tried to correlate it with lunar phases. Hospitals began building ledgers, hundreds of pages, patients, dates, doses, outcomes. A sick room became a spreadsheet. Some said it was cold, others said it saved lives. And in dusty archives, librarians began cataloging books, first by title, then by subject, then by keyword. One librarian wrote that he feared the human brain could no longer keep up with the volume of knowledge. Books multiply faster than the mind can read, he wrote. That was in 1779. He hadn't seen the internet. Meanwhile, mapmakers were refining their own systems of counting, not just of roads and borders, but of elevation, depth, and even darkness. In Italy, one cartographer tried to measure the varying shades of twilight across the Alps. In France, another attempted to chart the wind. Because why not? If something exists, it can be numbered, measured, entered, filed. But there was tension. Some resisted this urge. Poets warned that overlabeling would steal the magic from the world. One wrote, "You cannot pin the soul of a bird to a page." Romantic thinkers argued that awe should remain uncounted, that to catalog a sunset was to miss its warmth. And yet, they still recorded it in journals with adjectives, with paint. Because deep down, even the most lyrical mind wants to remember. And numbers remember better than memory alone. So they kept counting. More plants, more stars, more languages, dialects, river deltas, seashells, snowflakes. Even silence was measured again, this time not by monks, but by engineers building echo chambers to record the quietest sound possible. They built anechoic rooms and recorded the decibel of a pin drop. One researcher spent weeks trying to count the number of audible breaths a person makes in sleep. Meanwhile, census takers grew more precise. No longer just how many people, but how many rooms in each house, how many books, how many staircases, how many spoons. The minutiae of life entered ledgers that would never be read. It was madness and brilliance, because the world had always been too big, too fast, too strange. But now, for the first time, it almost seemed held. For a moment. Part 4, the century that tried to count everything. By the 19th century, counting had become a fever. The world was no longer measured by the curious few, but by institutions, empires, industries, bureaucracies, museums, universities. Everything from rainfall to rebellion was tracked, labeled, filed, and stamped. What once took lifetimes of private obsession was now standard procedure. The dream had shifted, no longer just to understand the world, but to possess it through numbers. The British Empire was a data empire. Its agents carried notebooks as often as rifles. In India, civil servants conducted vast surveys of population, language, caste, agriculture, crime. They made tables that ran for hundreds of pages. One administrator tried to count every single well in Bengal. Another cataloged the breeds of sheep in Punjab, down to their ear length and tail curve. These weren't curiosities. They were mechanisms of control. To rule, you had to know. To know, you had to count. And to count, you had to believe that even people could be reduced to columns and rows. So they measured skulls, weighed brains, timed how long it took someone to pronounce certain words. Entire pseudosciences emerged: phrenology, physiognomy, eugenics, all pretending that human worth could be read in millimeters. It was dangerous arithmetic, numbers masquerading as truth, statistics stripped of soul. Yet not all counting was sinister. Some came from compassion. In the smoky cities of industrial Europe, reformers began to count suffering. They tallied orphans, workhouse deaths, coal accidents. A woman in London counted how many hours a child spent making matches before collapsing. Another tracked how many steps a factory worker walked in a 14-hour shift, over 30,000. The numbers were shocking, but they worked. Legislators responded. Laws changed. A census in the right hands could be a moral tool. The United States took its own path. The first census was in 1790, just 6 questions. By 1850, it had ballooned. Age, race, occupation, literacy, property. By 1880, census takers used punch cards. Information wasn't just gathered, it was processed. Fast. A man named Herman Hollerith developed a machine to read those punch cards. It saved the Census Bureau millions in labor. It was so successful, Hollerith's company evolved into something new: IBM. Counting had become computation. Meanwhile, museums became temples of classification. In New York, Paris, Berlin, curators raced to acquire and label everything: butterflies, coins, teeth, armor, bones, bark, musical instruments, seeds. A tree from Madagascar was shipped branch by branch and reconstructed in a glass dome. A notebook recorded its dimensions down to the millimeter. Some collectors turned their homes into personal encyclopedias. A man in Belgium cataloged 500,000 postage stamps. Another in Boston kept a card file of every known moth in North America. Some went further. One attempted to collect and categorize every known kind of laughter, writing descriptions like nervous giggle, short, triumphant bray, and laugh followed by sob. Madness? Maybe, but also method. Because this was the century of systems. Library systems were standardized. Dewey Decimal numbers arrived. Every book found a place. Even thought had an address. Meanwhile, statisticians tried to count things no one had dared before. The average lifespan of a chimney sweep, the number of thoughts per hour in a resting adult, the volume of speech used in a lifetime. A French scholar claimed the average person would speak enough words to fill 500 books, if only someone wrote them down. And someone tried. One diarist wrote down every word he said for 2 years. Another counted every dream. One man made a list of every question he had ever asked and when. But even as the systems grew more elaborate, the gaps became clearer. No catalog could keep up. The world outpaced the lists. Plants mutated. Borders changed. Clouds refused to stay still. New species were found before the last had been described. Languages vanished faster than they could be documented. And still, the counting continued. Victorian encyclopedias ballooned to dozens of volumes. A ran for 300 pages. S took up 3 volumes alone. Children memorized lists of kings, rivers, planets, bones. School books became databases. Knowledge became format. There was comfort in it, predictability, a sense that the world could be arranged like drawers in a cabinet. But it was also exhausting. One philosopher warned, Soon we will drown in index cards. Another predicted the age of overdescription. Everything will be labeled twice, and still we will be unsure. And yet people persisted. Census takers trudged door to door with clipboards. Botanists pressed flowers into books. Bureaucrats wrote reports on the number of window panes in each post office. Somewhere, someone tried to catalog every kind of whisper. Somewhere else, someone counted the footsteps between raindrops in a spring puddle. These weren't scientists. They were witnesses trying to keep pace with a world that never stood still. And still doesn't. Because the urge remains. Even today, we track everything. Calories, heartbeats, emails, screen time, cloud shapes, bird songs, mood changes. We build apps to monitor sleep, exercise, traffic, mood. We count everything, sometimes just to feel in control, but also, perhaps, to feel present. Because when you count something, you notice it. And to notice is to care. The Victorians understood that. Their lists weren't perfect. Their systems were flawed. But their ambition, their passion, their belief that the world deserved attention, observation, preservation, that still matters. So let the counting continue, not because we can ever know it all, but because the act of trying is what makes the world visible. Even now, especially now. Part 5, From Counting Things to Predicting Futures. By the early 20th century, something strange had happened. Counting had changed. It was no longer just about knowing what was. It became about knowing what might be. A shift from inventory to prophecy, from documentation to prediction, from lists to likelihoods. Enter statistics. Not the kind you memorize in school, but the kind that shapes policies, builds economies, and decides how much wheat to plant or how many hospitals to open. Governments began hiring entire departments of people whose job was not to observe the world, but to guess what it would do next, based on the numbers it had already given them. If last year's harvest was good, and the rains arrived late, and the price of coal rose slightly, what would that mean for next year's grain output? These were the new questions. Numbers weren't just records, they were levers. Insurance companies were early adopters. They didn't need to know who would die, only how many. Actuaries counted accidents, illnesses, lifespans, and built a picture of risk. A man of 40, non-smoker, married, working in a bank, he had a life expectancy of X. Not because anyone knew his name, but because thousands like him had already been counted. It was cold, and brilliant, and terrifying. Because the world, it turned out, was rarely that tidy. Economists tried their hand at prediction too. They counted wages, imports, factory output, ship traffic. One government built a model of its entire economy on paper, rooms filled with charts and strings, trying to see what would happen if coal exports dropped by 10%. Sometimes it worked. More often, it didn't. No one predicted the Great Depression, or the oil shocks, or the sudden rise in birth rates after a war. For every successful projection, there were 10 that failed, but the hunger for foresight remained. Because the more we counted, the more we believed we could steer. Even weather forecasting, once the realm of lore and farmers' wisdom, became a science of probability. Meteorologists collected wind speeds, cloud formations, barometric pressure. They built equations, fed data into machines, tried to say not just it will rain, but there is a 70% chance of rain between 2 and 4 p.m. Suddenly, numbers came with decimals, fractions, margins of error. Uncertainty itself was being measured. This was a profound shift. Where ancient counters had sought totality, modern ones made peace with partial knowledge. They didn't say, "We know." They said, "We expect, we estimate, we project." But that didn't make it easier. Because the more systems we built, the more we saw their edges fray. As the world grew faster, its cities denser, its markets quicker, its weather stranger, our models began to fail in new ways. We began to count not only what we could see, but what we feared. Military strategists created complex models to predict invasion routes, casualty estimates, missile impact zones. During the Cold War, entire simulations were run daily, each one generating numbers, probabilities, nuclear acceptable losses. It was counting turned to calculus of destruction. Elsewhere, public health officials tracked flu outbreaks, cancer rates, malnutrition. Epidemiology, the counting of sickness, became a vital science, not just to understand illness, but to prevent it. How many people must be vaccinated to stop a disease? How long before a virus spreads from village to city? Numbers held answers if you knew how to ask, and if you trusted them. Because trust became a central issue. Who was doing the counting? What data were they using? What wasn't included? A population count that ignored the unhoused. A poll that asked only one region. A report that left out children or migrants. These were not just errors, they were distortions. The illusion of knowledge dressed in math. Yet despite the cracks, people kept counting and hoping. In psychology, researchers counted behaviors. How many seconds a child looked at a stranger? How many words a person used in a confession? How long it took for someone to abandon a puzzle? These numbers were turned into theories of memory, learning, personality. Entire diagnostic manuals, like the DSM, emerged from patterns of symptoms, each carefully counted, catalogued, coded. Meanwhile, archivists tried to preserve the past through metadata. A photo wasn't just an image, it had a date, a location, a description, a subject tag, a reference number. Histories became databases. The past became searchable. One historian joked that the medieval monk with his scroll would have wept to see how a single hard drive could contain more records than the Vatican archives. And yet, are we any closer to understanding? Because counting never guarantees comprehension. A million rows of data cannot replace a conversation. A chart of migration cannot explain why a person leaves their home. A census can tell you who sleeps in which room, but not who dreams at night or what they fear when they wake. And yet, the numbers keep us anchored. They tell us there were 112 earthquakes this year, that the average person laughs 17 times a day, that there are more stars in the sky than grains of sand on Earth. Are those numbers exact? No. But are they helpful? Somehow, yes. They remind us that we are part of something vast, trackable, mysterious, that we are not alone. Even as algorithms count our keystrokes, track our purchases, and recommend our next show to watch, the old question remains: how many? And its twin, what does it mean? Because counting without meaning is a closed door, but meaning without numbers drifts into mist. Somewhere between them is where we live. Between tally and truth, between chaos and clarity, between the people we are and the people we try to understand, one counted step at a time. Part 6, When the World Became a Spreadsheet. Somewhere along the way, we crossed a line. We stopped counting with numbers and started living inside them. The 20th century closed with the birth of the database age. Not a file here and there, not a dusty card catalog, but billions, no trillions of data points collected every second by invisible machines. A silent flood of counting, too fast for any human to follow. And yet we let it happen. We welcomed it. Because the machines offered something irresistible, total memory. Everything could be saved. Everything could be labeled. Everything could be sorted, searched, exported, backed up, cross-referenced, compared. The dream of the early encyclopedists, total knowledge, suddenly seemed within reach. Emails, bank records, satellite photos, supermarket inventories, birth registries, prescription data, temperature logs, genetic codes, all converted to numbers. Ones and zeros, bits and bytes, digital sand. Felt like magic. A library once needed walls, ladders, and silence. Now it fit on a flash drive. A census that once took years now runs in real time. A genome that once took decades now takes days. Even emotions were counted. Marketing firms tracked how long a person stared at an image, how often their heart rate changed while scrolling, how many times they hovered over a product before clicking. Happiness became heat maps, sadness became algorithms, desire became datasets, and slowly the world transformed. Cities installed sensors, traffic lights counted vehicles, trash bins tracked fullness, smart homes recorded footsteps, farmers used drones to count moisture in the soil, forest rangers counted tree loss by satellite. At every scale, the world became legible because someone somewhere had decided it needed to be counted. But legibility came at a price. As the numbers increased, understanding often decreased. The more data we had, the harder it became to see the shape of anything. Too many entries, too many graphs, too many possible truths. We didn't drown in ignorance, we drowned in knowledge. A data scientist once said, "We know more about the shopping habits of 22-year-olds than we do about the movement of clouds." She wasn't wrong, because data followed money, tension, risk, commerce, and often not wisdom. And yet, even in this strange new world, the old impulses remain. We still count stars. Now with space telescopes so sensitive they can see a galaxy from 13 billion years ago. We still count time, now with atomic clocks that lose 1 second every 300 million years. We still count people, but now with facial recognition and predictive models that guess what someone will do before they do it. It is powerful. It is unnerving. And it is still, at its core, human. Because behind the servers and systems are still people asking questions. People trying to bring order, trying to see patterns, trying to say, here is what the world looks like today. And sometimes that works beautifully. Librarians digitize rare manuscripts, making lost words available across continents. Epidemiologists track outbreaks before they spread. Conservationists monitor animal migrations from space, learning how to protect endangered herds in real time. These are not small victories. They are the modern expressions of an ancient act. To count not for control but for care. But there's a shadow too. Because when everything is counted, everything can be sold. Your steps, your sleep, your attention span, how long you hover over an ad, what you read, what you ignore, what you almost click, all become marketable. measurable, valuable, and in that something slips. We risk mistaking the measurable for the meaningful. We forget that just because something can be counted doesn't mean it should be. Who counts your breath while you sleep? Who decides how many steps mean? It's easy to lose yourself in a spreadsheet, to become a line item in someone else's ledger. And yet we count ourselves too. We wear fitness trackers. We track our habits. We journal moods, food, dreams, and expenses. Some count prayers. Others count poems. One person documented every sunset they saw for 5 years, assigning each a number from 1 to 10. The urge never vanished. It simply modernized. Even now, in the quiet corners of the internet, you'll find people maintaining personal libraries of odd lists. Every leaf they've ever collected, every bird call they've ever heard, every dream they've remembered. They aren't scientists. They aren't trying to monetize. They just care. Because counting is not always about power. Sometimes it's about reverence. To count the things that pass before they pass. To notice. To remember. And in that, there's hope. Yes, the world may now live inside servers. Yes, our actions may be tallied by scripts we cannot see. But the act of looking, of noticing, of gently placing a moment into a category, not to flatten it, but to hold it, that still lives. The world may be a spreadsheet now. But in the cells, if you look closely, are all the old dreams. Stars, seeds, sins, and silences. Still waiting to be named. Still refusing to sit still. Part 7, Why We Still Count the Uncountable. The story never ends. It bends, it grows, it loops back on itself. For as long as we've had questions, we've tried to answer them with numbers. And for as long as we've had numbers, we've learned that they never quite finish the sentence. But we keep trying. Even now, somewhere, someone is counting something you would never think to count. The number of cracks in a city sidewalk, the ways a crow tilts its head, the instances of silence in courtroom transcripts, the color of the ocean before storms, the number of times a baby kicks in the womb before birth. These efforts might never reach a journal. They may never be read aloud or entered into a database. But they're no less real. Because counting in its truest form is not about control. It's about noticing. The counting we most remember isn't always scientific or useful. It's the counting done in love. The way a child counts steps between street lamps. The way a baker learns the weight of dough by feel. The way someone counts down the days until someone returns. The tally marks carved into a prison wall, the beads on a prayer string, the number of heartbeats you hear when everything else is quiet. That's where it lives. That's where it always lived. Even the grandest counting projects, Linnaeus with his species, the encyclopedia with its volumes, NASA with its star charts, began with a single question: what is this? How many are there? How do I keep it from being forgotten? Counting is not just an act of measurement. It's an act of memory. The early monks who copied lists of virtues weren't just classifying, they were trying to live better. The herbalists who cataloged plants weren't just sorting leaves. They were preserving knowledge through war, plague, and time. The star watchers of Babylon weren't simply noting dots. They were mapping a universe that spoke in silence. And now we count in other ways. We count how many followers we have, how many views, how many likes. We count losses and wins and all the in-betweens. We count days since and days until. We pretend that counting gives us control, that if we know the numbers, we know the truth. But often it's the other way around. We count because we don't know, because the world is still too big, too fast, too full, because people still vanish into the background unless someone writes them down, because memories fade unless they're tallied, because species disappear unless someone notices their absence, because languages die unless someone counts their verbs. We count because we're afraid of forgetting. We count because we hope that by naming something, we might save it. And yet, even now, we know there are things that will never be caught in the net. How many raindrops fell on your skin when you first felt truly alive? How many dreams have? No list can hold those. And still, we try. Still, we whisper the old questions. How many stars? How many bones? How many chances? How many lives? Even now, we build archives of the obscure, museums of failed inventions, databases of extinct animals, catalogues of vanished smells, dead alphabets, forgotten rituals. Not because we expect to use them, but because we want them to matter. Somewhere in a library, there's a file on a town that no longer exists. Somewhere in a dusty cabinet, a shell collected by someone who never made it home. Somewhere in the cloud, a backup of a poem written by someone who never showed it to anyone. And it's all still counted, still waiting, still speaking. Because counting isn't about completion. It's about care, about witness, about the impossible, holy act of saying, "You were here, I saw you, I named you." And so we end where we began, not with a finished number, but with a human instinct. To look out at the infinite and to reach for it anyway. To count even knowing we never can.